Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Great Couch, where we will discuss all things ABA, entrepreneurship, and lifestyle. We have a very special series that will be dedicated to parents as well as parents of children with special needs. Today, I am excited to have Kanisha Newland Brathwaite join us on The Great Couch to discuss the IEP process. Thank you so much, Kanisha, for joining us today. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, sure. I'm Kanisha Newland Brathwaite. I am a school social worker working with the child study team. I'm also a private practice owner. My company, Serenity, Courage, and Wisdom Counseling. We are a virtual practice servicing communities throughout New Jersey.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us today. I know that you will be giving us so much information on the IEP process. I like to call it the alphabet soup process just because it can be super duper confusing for a lot of families to understand like what it entails and what do all of these acronyms mean. So just to lay the foundation, can you tell us what an IEP is?
Absolutely. So an IEP is an individualized education plan that's suited for students who qualify for that service, and it's supposed to be tailored for their specific educational needs.
Okay. And have I also heard of 504 plan or 504? Is that the same thing as an IEP?
It's not the same thing. So this is where a lot of families are kind of confused, like, hey, what's the difference? What do they both do? So in order to separate the two, we talk about accommodations and modifications, right? So if your child is not able to access the work based on their grade level, meaning that they're not able to do the work that's their peers are working on, and the work needs to be modified, then we will go the route of a 504, where we need to do other steps to help them to access this information. They may need other levels of intervention to help them get to the same playing field with their peers. A 504 plan is a little different, where your child can do the work, right? However, they may have some struggles in doing the work in either attention and focus. They may need some help in reducing distractions, just kind of things to help the environment to accommodate them, where they can then still produce the same quality work as their peers.
Okay, so I guess more so the IEP is really to help the child to access the same academic or the education that their peers are accessing and putting those accommodations or supports in place for them to be able to have the same level of education. Where the 504 plan is the child is able to do the work. However, there are environmental factors or things that are barriers to the child being able to be successful with their work.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
awesome. Thank you for that. Very, very clear explanation. So I know that, if a child may qualify for an IEP or a 504, there can be some differences as to how that decision is made. So can you tell me a little bit about how the decision can be made where the child would qualify for an IEP or a 504? Does every child, no matter what, qualify for those services?
Great question. So let's start with how we want to figure out whether or not a child does qualify, right? So typically, either a parent or a teacher can submit a request to the child study team just saying, hey, like my student or my child is having some difficulties either with their academics or, as you said earlier, with environmental factors. I want them to be evaluated by the child study team to see whether or not they qualify for services. That's the initial step. The next step will be after that, hey, let's come together. The child study team is going to organize a meeting together. It's called an identification meeting. And in this meeting, we are identifying what are the current concerns. What are the parents' concerns? What are the teachers' concerns? What's happening? And if there are if there are behavioral supports happening in school for that child, it's important to get all that information at the same time as well, because that gives us a clearer picture of
Mm-hmm.
what's happening. From the identification meeting, child study team will say, hey, you know what, along with a parent, I want that to be clear, because the parent is driving in the driver's seat this throughout the meetings,
Mm-hmm.
because they're the important one. They know their babies more than anything else,
Right.
and obviously want the best for their babies. So we want them to be able to understand like what's happening as we're going through it. So the parent, along with a child study team, we're going to discuss, does this meet the level of the level of the threshold, I should say, for the student to be tested, right? So there's a series of tests that happens if we say yes. If it's a no, we can end the process right there and say, okay, this sounds more of, let's say, a medical issue.
Mm-hmm.
Typical example, a student who has ADHD, is diagnosed with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
Their environment may be one that's not conducive for their learning.
Right.
So they may need some additional supports in that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a perfect example of when we would say, you know what, they are able to do the work. We're looking at their scores in the classroom. Mm-hmm. We're looking at all the assessment that they've done. They're able to do the work. They're just getting very distracted, for example, mm-hmm. right? Sticking with my student with ADHD, I may say to a parent, hey, if you have an official diagnosis, what we can do, take that letter from the doctor and create a 504 now. Mm-hmm. They didn't qualify the IEP because we've made that clear, right? Mm-hmm. Now we can say, hey, let's use the medical diagnosis and create for them a plan in their environment, in their classroom environment, that's mm-hmm. going to help to keep them on track. So that is where you would typically get that 504 plan.
Okay.
For families who, going back to the IEP process, if mm-hmm. they have done the tests and we are at the end of that process now, we're coming back to the table with the family along with all the evaluators. And we're saying, okay, this is how the student performed on these tests. Mm-hmm. Each evaluator is going to break down the evaluation that they completed with the student and explain that to the parent so that they're in full aware of, they're fully aware of how their student performed. Mm-hmm. Based on that, the decision again comes back to, is that yes or no? Based on the test, does this child meet the threshold for receiving an IEP, or do we need to do some modifications to their to their environment based on what we're seeing in the test results, right? Okay. So again, there are different points throughout the process where we're assessing 504 mm-hmm. IEP.
Okay.
What's the best fit for that child? And then if it's hey, yes, they do meet the threshold, these are the things that we can do, the services that we can provide for them with mm-hmm. an IEP, then you are on track for those services. If it is a no at the end of reviewing those evaluations, and as I stated, we're going to figure out, hey, do they still need additional supports? We can go that route with that. Or there may also be, hey, we've done these series of evaluations, but now we may need to explore other evaluations to get a clearer indication if there's something else that's happening that's just not being detected by the standard psychological or educational evaluation that's typically requested. There may be a psychiatric evaluation that needs to be done, a developmental evaluation. So there's a lot of different nuances to it. We just want to make sure that we are able to see everything that's happening with that baby so that we can get them the best services that they need.
Right. Wow. Seems like there's a lot of steps to the process overall. It's just not, I want an IEP or I want a 504 or my kid is having some barrier. So like it starts the next day. it seems
Right.
like there's a lot of, like there's a process that has to happen. So I know you mentioned we a lot, and prior you also said CST. So what does CST stand for, and who are those people that make up the CST?
CST is a child study team. And it's just that, a team of individuals that come together, and we're reviewing all the requests that comes in. Consisting of the team would be the social worker, or case manager. Some school districts is different. In my school, for example, I play both roles. So, you are the social worker and the case manager. But typically, a case manager, the psychologist, the educational consultant. There's also the learning specialist, which is a special education teacher, is also present. There's also the teachers are involved as well in that process, along with the special education. Some schools may have the assistant principal as the special education lead.
Mm-hmm.
So that person's also involved in the process as well. They're also dependent on what's happening with that child. We may invite other evaluators to be a part of the meeting, mm-hmm. such as the speech and language pathologist, the occupational therapist. And again, that's on a case by case, depending on what's presenting with the child.
Okay. And in terms of the IEP or 504, if a child qualifies for that additional service per se, does it mean that they will have it throughout their academic journey? Or is it just like for a specific school year and then the next school year it stops?
So it depends. The purpose of the IEP is to, remember I talked about the threshold of mm-hmm. the peers. So if we notice that a student is not performing within the same threshold of their peers, the goal of the IEP is to get them to the same level. Okay. There are situations where students, we're trying to close that gap mm-hmm. over time. So it's doing the interventions on a smaller, kind of like chunking scenario, so that they can access the information in bits and pieces instead of an overload for some students mm-hmm. in one bit. It may be too much. It may be exhausting. So we want to be able to get them to the same level over time. Okay. For many students, that they may absolutely I want to say graduate from their IEP. I actually had a student that made like a really big thing, because it really is a big thing, mm-hmm. where you don't necessarily need an IEP because you have closed that gap. And that's amazing, because the interventions and the tools that are put in place worked, and it helped you to be on the same level with your peers. Right. So some students may need to continue having those services. They're college students who have IEPs in place. Mm-hmm. Just because they learn differently. Right. And that's okay. So we want to make sure that whatever level of your education, you're able to access the information, whether you need additional help or additional supports, that's okay, but you can produce quality work with your peers.
Okay. And I know a little earlier you mentioned parents being in the driver's seat and being a part of this process. So how is it that, maybe at your school or just in general across the board in various districts, how is it that parents are able to be fully a part of the process and also, I guess, consulted with on some of those decisions as it relates to their children? How have you fostered that?
I usually try to tell my parents, you are your child's best advocate, right? And there are a lot of times where, as communicated to me by parents, like they don't feel like they're a part of. When we sit down at the table, and I say we because, again, I'm a part of a team. So it's not just Kanisha alone making decisions. No, we're all sitting down at the team together, and we're talking about, this is what the criteria for special education looks like, right? And we want to make sure that we're very clear on where does your child fall right now, what we can do to help support them. Along with it, the conversation may also be with mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever the caregiver is, what additional supports can be done at home to support them as well, because again, it's a partnership.
Right.
While students are in the building for a certain period of time, they're also home for another significant portion of their day. Right. So that support has to be continuous. I advocate for having very clear and frank conversations with my parents, even some who are opposed to their child being classified, or they don't want their child to be labeled, which is a lot of, negative stigma that can come with that. But again, the focus and the intent is your child's best academic interest, and making sure that they are able to get the support that they need. And as parents are part of these conversations with their child study teams, they can also get a clearer understanding of, are they getting the vibe of that teamwork? And if they're not, then definitely advocate for themselves on what additional supports do they need when they're going into a meeting. What supports do they need to reach out to as far as understanding the special education process, so that they can be heard.
So parents can bring someone with them as an advocate or a support to the meetings?
They can bring someone with them. I do tell parents, talk to your case manager ahead of time as well, just so that they're in the know of what's happening or who's coming. But be very clear when they go to the meeting, who is this person that's coming and what role they're going to be playing, because it's very important to the process to know, hey, mom or dad, or as I said, caregiver, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, whoever the child resides with, this is someone who is significant in this child's life as well. And they're also bringing important information to the table about this baby. So what else can we collect from that individual to help ensure that we're getting the clearest picture on what's needed, and also the parent is feeling the most supported.
Okay. And is the child allowed to come to the IEP meeting, or the student, I should say?
The student. Typically at age 14, students are invited to attend their IEP meeting. It's not a guarantee. It's not they don't necessarily have to be there. We just want to make sure that there is a guardian, a parent or guardian who is able to sign the legal documents to put the services in place that's present at the meeting. I've had students who, as I'm typically working with the 3rd and 4th graders, I've had students who popped into my office while their parent is there, and we're talk to us. What do you think you're doing well? And it's really always, for me, it's always interesting to hear them talk about themselves and be very honest and candid about what they feel that their strengths and needs are. So it doesn't hurt to ask them as well.
And I think that it's great to have the idea of having the child there, or the student in the room, even if it's, like you said, just popping in your office for a brief moment, because I think that helps to start the advocacy process, right? Because you said at age 14 is when they're officially invited and kind of taking some more ownership over their plan.
Right.
And, if a child is already kind of used to, even if it's a young child and they don't really say anything or know what's going on, just the fact of potentially their presence is starting that self-advocacy, which I think is great that you all, have students that will pop in or, invite students to those meetings.
Yeah. And it's important for them to also see the collectivism that's happening too, right? So everybody is here for me. I get that a lot too from students. Why is everybody here? We're all here to support you. And we all, have your best interest, and we want you to be your academic best, your personal best. well-rounded individuals. So we're all here talking about different ways that we can all support you.
Mhm.
And I get a lot of, some students are overwhelmed by that. Some
Yeah.
students are excited that they have their own team
Mhm.
of people. Although we were there all along, but seeing everybody together,
Right.
it can definitely, as you said, like put
Mhm.
them into a different headspace where it's like, okay, so I have my own village, so
Mhm.
to speak.
Yeah, that's really great.
Hmm.
So I know we've been talking just, about the process and what that looks like generally, but are you able to, I guess just like walk me through if I'm a brand new, parent, I've put in my initial request for
Right.
the IEP, what, and assuming that, my child will qualify, what does that look like? What are the steps? Is it like, okay, I put my request in, 15 days later, I get a response. 10 days later, I get my IEP and my kid is good? Or is it a longer process? What does that look like?
So typically the state has mandates as far as how many days in between each step.
Hmm.
So I'm glad that you mentioned those specific days. So New Jersey state, each state is different. So
Hmm.
you want to be clear on what the legalities are, depending on what state you're residing. New Jersey state states that once a parent submits that initial request for identification meeting,
Hmm.
right, which is like, hey, like I want my child evaluated,
Right.
they have 20 days to respond, and 20 days by that point you should be having a meeting.
Mm.
From there you're deciding yes or no, does this child um, meet the threshold for the next phase, which is evaluations. Do we find, is there enough findings that there is something happening, that
Okay.
this child is not accessing the information or they're not performing? From that point, if it's a yes, we are moving towards testing. Over the course of, if it's a no, the process ends there,
Okay.
right? If it's a yes, we are moving towards testing, as I said, and we have 90 days to get these tests and evaluations completed
Hmm.
to have the eligibility meeting.
Okay.
At the eligibility meeting, I'm saying, are you eligible for services?
Okay.
Sometimes you'll hear non-eligibility as well,
Hmm.
because that tells me that you, based on the scores, based on how your child performed, they are not eligible for services for these reasons. And at that point, you'll get, in every meeting, you're going to receive documentation that's explaining to you what took place. And you should always, parents always receive documentation, always receive copies.
Hmm.
I can't tell you the amount of times that parents are like, oh, no one gave me this. Always ensure that you have your paperwork together before you leave that meeting. So at that point, if your student is eligible for services, your school may do an initial IEP where
Okay.
they talk to you about what the services are going to look like for your kiddo
Okay.
and what's helpful. If they are not eligible for services, again, it'll end there.
Okay.
Um, when I say end there, that doesn't mean that you can't come back to the table and say, in typically in 6 to 8 weeks, hey, there are interventions that the school is doing to help um, track your child's progress. And
Hmm.
we want to see a little bit clearer, are these interventions working for them? Because then maybe we need to come back to the table again and decide, do we want to, what else is happening with this
Hmm.
baby, right? um, it doesn't necessarily close the loop. You can always request
Okay.
for an IEP. That sometimes parents get that, what they get defeated, or they feel like, well, this is it, like no one else can help me because they didn't qualify today.
Hmm.
No, let's continue assessing, and let's, continue to gather documentation and see what else is happening, still providing some level of supports
Hmm.
um, within the school, and seeing if that's helpful or not. And it's, you're always able to put a request in again at a later date and say, hey, like I've been watching, I've been seeing, we've been doing these things and it's not helping. Can
Okay.
we meet again and reconvene?
Okay. And if it is that the child is eligible, then is it that year mark where you all review, I think it's the annual review process where you all review the goals, and then is it 3 years that the child would be reevaluated?
Yes,
Okay.
you are so good. So, so once the initial is done, right? We remember we already did the eligibility. So yes, you're good to go with needing services, and this is what it looks like, and we've done that initial. From that point, every year you have technically 364 days to make sure that you have a meeting with the school to reauthorize for another year, right? And just like you said, every 3 years, students are retested. That number can be shifted depending on circumstances. So, where you can delay up to 1 year
Okay.
of the triennial, but typically, as a standard, it's every 3 years students are retested. And why? You may have a kindergartner, for example, perfect example. Kindergarten came in, they were tested. Now they're going into the fourth grade. That child may not be performing the same level they did as a kindergartner. So we want to
Right.
see, we've put in these interventions. One, are they working? Two, has that child made any improvements in their cognitive and their educational abilities? And what if it, and three, has there been any changes that we can then adjust the different tools that we're using to help them? So we want to see where they're performing, how are they growing, what's working, what's not working, so that we can then reevaluate ourselves.
Okay, great. And I
Mm-hmm.
know a little earlier you mentioned that the child may qualify for certain services. And then I know you mentioned on the team or at the meeting, sometimes a PT or a speech therapist or occupational therapist will be present. So what are some of those like related services that a child could qualify for?
Sure. So related services can include counseling, so meeting with myself, a counselor in the school. Um, they may need speech and language therapy, where they'll have the speech and language pathologist that will meet with them. Um, it can differ from weekly. I don't want to say weekly because it depends on the needs of the child. So some students are receiving maybe 3 times a week because their deficiency is that great where they need the additional support that much. Um, and it again, it's an individualized education plan for a
Right.
reason. It should be based on that child's needs.
So the
Um,
frequency of service could vary.
Absolutely. So you have speech and language. You may have occupational therapists if there are difficulties with gross or fine motor skills, or there are things that they need to work on that'll help them in the classroom. So those services are going to be tailored again based on the child's needs. You may have a physical therapist depending on what the diagnosis of your child is. So you've have some students who are using a walker, for example. They need to have additional services and support in school, right? So that the therapist may be on site, or your school may have to contract out to have that support there for your student.
Okay. And I've heard also of nursing services for students that have medical conditions. Is that
Yeah.
also something that's offered still?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Absolutely. That's another layer of support.
Okay, wow. Well, it seems like the IEP process as a whole is a process. So
hmm
I do want to thank you for, explaining all that is entailed in an IEP, all that is entailed in a 504, to us in, relatable, easy language, because I think with all of the laws that are out there, and all the services and classifications and parents not knowing, can I be a part of it, can I say I don't want this, can I say I do want this, can I bring an
Right.
advocate, can my child be there?
Right.
Can be a lot and very overwhelming. So I really appreciate you today, Kanisha, and again, thank you for your time and your expertise
Absolutely.
in this area, because like I said,
Absolutely.
this can be a lot for families.
It is a lot. And what I would say to families, ask your school for it's a document called a prize. It's a parental rights on special education. So is a very thick document, but it goes through what is your right as a parent, what are you entitled to, what services looks like. It breaks down a lot of what I talked about. It breaks down a lot of that in detail for you as well. So you can ask your school case manager to print you out a document if you want to review it ahead of a meeting, or have them go through it with you. They should be able to accommodate and do that as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful, because I think it is important for parents to know their rights. I think that is like one of the first steps of being really able to truly advocate, is knowing what your rights are. So thank you for that. So if people want to get further connected with you, how could they reach you?
Sure, they can send me an email at kbrathwaite@serenitycouragewisdom.co, or they can hit me up on Instagram, kbrathwaite. Send me a DM and just be like, hey, Kanisha, I saw you here with Nandy and I have some questions, and I'll be free to definitely reach out and try to help you as best as I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Kanisha, for your time, and we will see you soon.